I'm going to begin my talk rather unconventionally by telling you a story. It concerns a certain 13-year-old girl who got a Fitbit for Christmas, a fitness enthusiast. She loved it, used it 24/7, but in her mid-teens, her relationship with food and exercise turned toxic. An eating disorder developed, and soon the device that had brought fun and motivation became a prison. After trying to give up the device on 3 separate occasions throughout her recovery, it always crept back into her life and once again consumed her thoughts. Even now fully recovered, she doesn't fully trust herself to use one of the many Fitbits that are lying in her drawer. That girl was me. My intentions today are not to condemn Fitbits or similar devices, which is what you may think, but I do want to make you think and make up your own minds regarding some of the complex ethical issues surrounding the selling of these devices to children. There is limited research on this topic, but I believe it's imperative that we begin this discussion. So, the first thing that we need to talk about, since we're talking about Fitbits, is the huge crisis in obesity. So apparently 81% of children aged 11 to 17 are considered insufficiently active, and actually 20% are considered overweight or obese. So so basically Fitbit's recent release of the Fitbit Ace for age 6 to 13 is just one of the many activity trackers being released to target the children's market in an attempt to incentivize children to lead a healthier lifestyle. Fitbit motivates the kids to achieve certain activity or step goals by earning them badges. The device is also very family orientated, as the app links to the parent's phone, so the parent can see how many steps the child is doing and set step goals for them. It must be pointed out that this kids activity tracker does not actually track calories, so the risk of being overly concerned or aware about food intake is mitigated. So research so far is limited on the subject, but one study specifically on the effectiveness of activity trackers on increasing children's activity levels does seem to support these findings, certainly showing evidence of positive results in the short term. Now, this craze in activity trackers for all ages is part of a much bigger craze of gamification. So, gamification is the use of gaming systems and other systems and devices to encourage greater engagement. It is a concept, it is a minefield for business ethicists. There is so much literature to suggest the addictive nature of gamified devices. This raises questions about the ethics of selling consumers gamified systems, which could lead to harm if they become addicted. So just take the rather amusing example of Pokemon Go, which I'm sure you've all heard of, where people apparently injured themselves just trying to catch a new Pokemon. The complexities really lie in whether it's the responsibility of the organisations to take into account these risks, or if the responsibility is purely on the consumer. So coming back to kids' Fitbits, the same study by Ridgers et al. Does highlight some of the concerns towards the not knowing about the long-term implications of using these devices, and if quantifying activity could have an adverse effect on children's mental health and development as they grow up. Eating disorder psychologist Dr. Bryony Bamford comments that the majority of children seem to respond positively to these tracking apps and devices. However, if there are people, or in this case children, who are predisposed to developing disordered eating or are already developing such tendencies, these apps and devices could be problematic. There does exist empirical evidence correlating the use of gamified fitness trackers to triggering and incurring disordered relationships with food in adults. Therefore, it does seem that possible that a similar reaction could occur in children. Now, Simpson and Mazio's findings are particularly interesting. It was found that whilst caloric tracking did lead to some restricted eating and concerns, it was activity tracking not caloric tracking, which most strongly correlated with disordered eating behaviours. Now, this is fascinating, as I noted that children's activity trackers are marketed at being safe for children because they don't track calories, they just track activity. However, this paper's findings would suggest that this does very little to mitigate encouraging disordered behaviours in children. It is, however, well researched that disordered eating is a mixture of both genetic predisposal and environmental factors. And the children who are most at risk are those who have like a double dose. So parents that have passed on that genetic predisposition, but are also showing signs of obsessiveness with eating and thinness and tracking. So in addition, Mazio and Bullock highlight that kids who are predisposed to EDs do go out and search for an environment which will validate these feelings. Common examples given are ballet, gymnastics, and modelling. I would argue that Fitbits perform a similar function of validation of disordered thinking. Okay, so a further concern expressed by business ethicists in the use of gamified devices is that they can create something which can be used to turn something that's a form of play into a form of labour. Something that P.J. Ray, a business ethicist, coined playbore. This concept seems to acquire a new dimension in considering children, for whom free play is an essential part of their social, cognitive, physical, and emotional development. Experts such as Dr. Lauren Shearer, who's a specialist in physical activity and health in children, and Dr. Dale Elsilger, a specialist in wearable technology for behavioural change, are beginning to express concerns about these devices' potential to sabotage play in a way where a child will only see play as important if it racks up their step count. Whilst it remains speculative, it's certainly an interesting consideration. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the ethical arguments behind this. So utilitarianism is basically where we see that what is right is what creates the greatest good for the greatest number. Therefore, taking into consideration this research from a utilitarian perspective, it still seems right that these organisations like Fitbit should be trying to get kids more active, considering the sheer scale of the obesity crisis and the very small number of children who are likely to go on to develop disordered eating, which is somewhere between 1.2 and 3% of the population. As the results so far seem positive, it seems that if a small number of children are triggered to go on and develop issues, this seems of little importance, as from a utilitarian viewpoint, this is like a reasonable sacrifice for the greater good. Secondly, virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is basically a concept that came about in ancient Greek times, which is largely associated with Aristotle. It focuses on individuals rather than the greater number and their ability to achieve the good life, which involves them achieving certain moral virtues and also obtaining balance, something that Aristotle called the golden mean. So virtue ethics would lead us to conclude that giving Fitbits to kids is actually wrong. The ethical issues here from this approach are twofold. So firstly, as the devices could risk problems in development in young children and undermine holistic well-being and flourishing, which incorporates mental health and cognitive development. This impinges on a child's ability to lead the good life. In addition, the addictive quality of gamified systems and therefore these devices undermine Aristotle's conception of the golden mean. So, in conclusion, we don't know the answers to how this new trend in activity trackers for kids is going to impact future generations. Short-term research shows that children's activity levels could be increased by giving kids Fitbits, and perhaps companies are well-intentioned in bringing these products to market. However, I think it's important, and it is quite worrying, that both organisations and consumers are willing to market these devices and integrate them into their lives without fully considering the ethical implications of their actions, especially when this may come at the cost of the happiness and the development of young children. Thank you.